23 stab wounds, 60 senators, and not a single one of them died of old age. In 44 BC, the most powerful man on earth was surrounded by the very people who were supposed to serve alongside him. They walked out of that room, drenched in his blood, expecting the crowd to carry them on their shoulders. That never happened. Instead, what followed was a 12-year hunt that destroyed every single man who held a blade that day. Some were tortured beyond recognition. Some were beheaded in foreign lands, surrounded by strangers. One killed himself over a battle he had actually won, and the person who brought all of them down was an 18-year-old boy that nobody took seriously. Before any of that, though, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. Now, let's get into it. The killing of Julius Caesar didn't happen in a moment of rage. It was months in the making. Secret meetings behind closed doors after midnight. Lists of names written down and then burned. Senators who couldn't be trusted were kept out. Senators who could be pressured were pulled in. The whole operation ran on two fuels, resentment and fear. Resentment because Caesar had crushed every rival, collected every title, and twisted every Roman institution to serve himself. Fear because the men in that room believed that if they waited any longer, the chance would be gone forever. But here's the problem with a conspiracy that large. 60 men sharing a secret means 60 ways for it to fall apart. One loose word at dinner, one guilty conscience, one senator who drinks a little too much wine and says something he shouldn't. So they moved fast, and they built the entire plan around 3 men. Gaius Cassius Longinus was one of the most decorated military minds Rome had ever produced. He had fought in the East. He had survived one of Rome's worst military disasters, a catastrophic defeat where 20,000 Roman soldiers were slaughtered by the Parthians. He came back harder, colder, and deeply bitter, because no matter what he accomplished, Cassius was always second. Caesar had promoted others ahead of him. Caesar had handed out positions that Cassius believed belonged to him, and when Caesar declared himself dictator for life, Cassius understood exactly what that meant for men like him. The door was closing permanently. Cassius didn't need convincing. He was the one doing the convincing. He wrote letters, he held meetings, he built the network, but he also understood something essential about Roman public opinion. A group of bitter senators stabbing the head of state would look like nothing more than a power grab. They needed someone the public actually respected. They needed a name that meant something. They needed Brutus. Marcus Junius Brutus was Roman prestige made flesh. His family line stretched back to the man who had overthrown Rome's last king and built the Republic from the ground up. That name wasn't just respected, it was sacred. Brutus studied philosophy. He wrote about virtue and duty and moral obligation. He had genuinely convinced himself, or at least tried to, that the Republic was worth dying for. Caesar knew all of this and trusted him completely. He had pardoned Brutus after the Civil War, promoted him to one of the most important political positions in Rome, and treated him with what people at the time described as fatherly warmth. Some ancient sources even suggest Caesar may have literally been his father, the result of a long affair with Brutus's mother decades earlier. True or not, the closeness was real, and Cassius used it. Anonymous letters started appearing at Brutus's home. Messages were left carved into his ancestor's statue in the Forum, all of them carrying the same message. Your ancestor ended a king's reign and saved Rome. What exactly are you doing right now? Brutus joined, and with his name attached to the conspiracy, the assassination could be framed as an act of principle rather than ambition. The third man is the one most history books skip over entirely, and he might be the most important piece of the whole thing. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, completely separate from Marcus Brutus, was Caesar's closest personal friend. They had fought side by side in Gaul for years. Caesar had trusted him with independent military command. He had written him into his will as a secondary heir. This was not a political ally. This was the man Caesar shared meals with. On the morning of March 15th, Caesar almost didn't go. His wife Calpurnia had been having nightmares. Priests were reporting bad omens across the city. Caesar told his staff he would skip the Senate session entirely. The entire plot was on the verge of collapsing before a single blade was drawn. Decimus went to Caesar's home personally. He told him the omens had been misread. He told him the Senate was preparing to offer him a major new honor. He told Caesar it would look weak, even cowardly, to stay home because of a woman's dreams. Caesar got up and went. Decimus walked beside him the entire way to the theater of Pompey. He led his closest friend, step by step, into a room where 60 men were waiting with daggers tucked beneath their togas. When the session opened, a senator named Tullius Cimber approached Caesar with a petition. He reached out, grabbed Caesar's toga, and pulled it down from his shoulder. That was the signal. Casca struck first. A clumsy, panicked slash at Caesar's neck that barely broke the skin. Caesar grabbed the blade, spun around, and shouted. Then the rest closed in. 23 stab wounds delivered by senators stumbly, NG over each other in the chaos, some accidentally cutting their own allies in the frenzy. Most of the wounds were superficial. The ones that actually killed him came from only 2 or 3 blades. Caesar fought back at first, pushing and struggling. Then he saw Brutus among them. He stopped. He pulled his toga up over his face and fell at the base of Pompey's statue. The senators stood over the body. Some smeared the blood on their own faces. They raised their daggers in the air and walked out into the forum, expecting cheering crowds. The forum was completely empty. The people of Rome had heard the screaming and fled. What came next is one of the most staggering political miscalculations in all of recorded history. These men had spent months carefully planning how to kill Caesar. They had spent 0 time thinking about what came after. No speech prepared, no transition of power arranged, no military force secured, no message sent to the legions, no successor named. 60 men had just murdered the head of state in broad daylight, and their entire plan for the aftermath was that people would understand. People did not understand. Mark Antony was Caesar's co-consul and his most devoted political ally. On the day of the assassination, one of the conspirators had been assigned specifically to keep Antony away from the chamber. He pulled him aside and engaged him in conversation while the killing happened inside. The conspirators had actually debated killing Antony as well. Brutus refused. He argued that more killing would make them look like tyrants rather than liberators. That single decision would cost nearly all of them their lives. Within hours, Antony had secured Caesar's personal documents, his treasury, and his will. He had talked Caesar's widow into handing over everything. Then he asked permission to speak at Caesar's funeral. The conspirators agreed. Another catastrophic mistake. Thousands gathered in the Roman Forum. Soldiers, citizens, freed slaves, merchants, the poor who had spent years benefiting from Caesar's policies. Antony stood over the body, and he didn't scream. He didn't call for blood. He did something far more effective. He read Caesar's will out loud. Every Roman citizen would receive 75 drachmas, roughly 3 months of wages for a working man. Caesar's private gardens along the Tiber would be opened as public parks for the citizens of Rome, forever. Then Antony paused. He held up Caesar's toga, torn, stained, the stab wounds clearly visible. Torn, stained, the stab wounds clearly visible. He pointed to each one and named the senator responsible. The crowd started weeping. Then Antony asked one question. "Does this look like the body of a tyrant?" The crowd exploded. They tore wooden benches out of the forum, ripped doors off nearby buildings, broke apart merchant stalls, and built an enormous pyre right there in the open square. They cremated Caesar's body on the spot. Then they grabbed torches from the fire and went looking for blood. Mobs swept through Rome that night. The homes of known conspirators were set on fire. A poet named Cinna, who had absolutely nothing to do with the assassination, was beaten to death in the street simply because he shared a name with one of the conspirators. The men who had called themselves liberators barricaded themselves on the Capitine Hill with hired gladiators as their only protection. 48 hours after killing Caesar, the men who had planned to save Rome couldn't safely walk through it. A fragile truce held for a few weeks, and amnesty was negotiated. The assassins wouldn't be prosecuted, but all of Caesar's laws and appointments would remain in effect. Nobody was satisfied. Brutus and Cassius lingered in Rome for a while, but the streets had turned hostile. Veterans of Caesar's campaigns cursed them open. One by one, the conspirators left the city. Brutus went to Athens. Cassius went to Syria. Decimus went north to command his legions in Gaul. They told themselves they were regrouping, they were running. And this is where everything accelerates, because while the assassins scattered across the Mediterranean, a new figure arrived in Rome, an 18-year-old with no military experience, a frail body that had plagued him his entire life, and a name that would make him the most dangerous person in the ancient world. His name was Gaius Octavius. Caesar had secretly adopted him and made him the primary heir to everything. And what this teenager did over the next 12 years makes the assassination itself look almost irrelevant. When Octavian arrived in Rome in April of 44 BC, nobody took him seriously. He had been studying in what is now Albania when news of Caesar's murder reached him. His mother and stepfather begged him not to go to Rome. They told him to refuse the inheritance. They told him he would be killed. He went anyway. His first move was to legally take Caesar's name. He became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Then he immediately used that name to recruit. Caesar's veterans, tens of thousands of soldiers who had spent years fighting in Gaul and Africa and Spain, had been promised land and money upon retirement. With Caesar dead, those promises were suddenly uncertain. Antony had seized Caesar's funds and was distributing them on his own terms. Octavian sold his own property. He borrowed from Caesar's allies, and he paid the veterans out of his own pocket. Entire legions began switching their loyalty. Antony dismissed him publicly and called him a boy who owed everything to a name. That boy would outlive him by decades. By late 43 BC, the situation had fractured into complete chaos. Antony controlled the largest army. Octavian had the Caesar name and growing legions. A general named Lepidus held forces in Gaul and Spain. Rather than destroy each other, they made a deal. On a small island in a river near Bologna, the three men met and divided the Roman world. The three men met and divided the Roman world among themselves. They called it the Second Triumvirate. Their first order of business was a list. They needed money. They needed to eliminate political enemies. They needed to send a message, so they revived an old Roman practice called proscription. Names posted publicly in the forum. If your name appeared on that list, you were legally dead. Anyone could kill you. Your property was seized. Your family lost all legal protections. Anyone who sheltered you faced execution themselves. The first list contained 300 senators and 2,000 members of Rome's business and political class. Each of the three men contributed names. The negotiations were completely transactional. Antony wanted Cicero dead. Rome's greatest orator had publicly destroyed Antony in a series of devastating speeches. Octavian initially resisted handing Cicero over. He eventually traded Cicero's life in exchange for the deaths of his own political opponents on Antony's list. Lepidus gave up his own brother. When the lists went public, Rome descended into open slaughter. Cicero was 63 years old. He had spent 40 years as the single most influential voice in Roman political life. He had exposed conspiracies. He had defended the Republic in courtroom battles and Senate chambers across decades. He believed until the very end that words were more powerful than swords. When the proscription lists went up, Cicero tried to escape by sea. Bad weather drove his ship back to shore. His slaves carried him on a litter toward another port. Antony's soldiers caught him on a road outside his own villa. Cicero reportedly told his slaves to set the litter down. He looked at the centurion walking awed him and said, "There is nothing proper about what you are doing, soldier, but do try to kill me properly." They cut off his head and both of his hands. Antony had the head brought to him. According to multiple Roman historians, his wife Fulvia took Cicero's severed head, placed it on her dining table, pulled out the tongue with her fingers, and stabbed it repeatedly with a hairpin, for every speech the tongue had ever made against her husband. The head and hands were then nailed to the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum, the exact place where Cicero had delivered his most famous speeches. The message required no translation. Eloquence would not save you, and if the most famous voice in Rome could be killed and put on display like a trophy, then nobody was safe. The assassins were next. Gaius Trebonius had one assignment during the assassination: keep Mark Antony out of the room. He did exactly that. He stood in the corridor and made small talk with Antony while the daggers came out inside. After the killing, Trebonius fled east and eventually became governor of the province of Asia in what is now western Turkey. In early 43 BC, one of Antony's commanders arrived in the region with an army, captured the city where Trebonius was based, and took him alive. What followed was not a quick execution. Trebonius was kept alive and interrogated over a period of days. Roman sources describe him being beaten and tortured repeatedly. When they were finished, he was beheaded. His head was kicked through the streets like a ball. Then it was sent to Antony. Trebonius was the first of the assassins to die. He would not be the last. Decimus Brutus, the man who had personally walked Caesar to his death, had been assigned the province of Cisalpine Gaul. After the assassination, he had legions. He had a strategic position. For a brief moment, he looked like the most militarily capable. Lair, the remaining conspirators. It collapsed quickly. When Antony marched north to claim Gaul for himself, Decimus was besieged at the city of Mutina. The Senate, still partially sympathetic to the conspirators, sent relief armies, including Octavian among the commanders. The siege was broken, and Antony retreated. Then Octavian turned. Rather than continue supporting the conspirators, Octavian made his deal with Antony and joined the triumvirate. Decimus suddenly found himself completely isolated. No allies, no political support. Surrounded by legions that no longer recognized his authority. His own soldiers started deserting. He disguised himself and tried to flee north across the Alps to reach Brutus's forces in Macedonia, traveling through hostile territory with a small escort. A Gallic chieftain captured him. Decimus reportedly tried to bribe his way out. It didn't work. The chieftain sent a message to Antony asking what to do with the prisoner. The answer came back immediately: kill him. Decimus was executed in a remote village in Gaul. The man who had walked beside Caesar on the last morning of his life died far from Rome, abandoned by everyone he had ever trusted. His head was sent to Antony. Between 43 and 42 BC, the rest of the conspirators fell in a cascade. Minucius Basilis, one of the more aggressive senators during the stabbing, was murdered by his own slaves in his own home. Tilius Cimber, who had given the signal by grabbing Caesar's toga, fled east and tried to build a naval force. He was defeated at sea and vanished from the historical record. Most scholars believe he died during the fighting. Casca, the man who struck the first blow, likely died at Philippi, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. Several others were killed in various skirmishes and battles during the civil wars that followed. The pattern was identical every time. Flee, fight, lose, die. Nobody came to save them. But the two men who mattered most were still alive. Brutus and Cassius, the face and the architect of the conspiracy, had spent 2 years raising armies across the eastern provinces, 19 legions between them. They controlled Greece, Syria, and much of Asia Minor. They genuinely believed they still had a chance to save the Republic. By the autumn of 42 BC, two enormous armies faced each other across a narrow plain in northern Greece near the town of Philippi. Brutus and Cassius had roughly 100,000 men, anchored on high ground, supplied by sea, dug into fortified positions. Antony and Octavian had a slightly larger force, but they were exhausted from the march across Greece, running low on supplies, and dealing with Octavian's ongoing illness. By some accounts, Octavian was so sick during the battle he had to be carried on a litter. The strategic advantage belonged entirely to Brutus and Cassius. Better position, better supply lines. All they had to do was wait. Antony knew this, so he forced the issue. He launched a direct assault on Cassius's wing, driving through marshy terrain to hit the fortifications head-on. The fighting was close and brutal and chaotic, soldiers pushing through trenches and walls in hand-to-hand combat. Antony's forces broke through. Cassius's camp was overrun, and on the other side of the battlefield, Brutus had launched his own attack and was winning. His forces smashed into Octavian's wing, overran the camp, and sent Octavian's soldiers running. Octavian himself barely escaped. One account says he hid in a marsh. The battle was essentially a draw, but Cassius didn't know that. From where he was standing, all he could see was his own camp on fire and enemy soldiers everywhere. A massive cloud of dust rising from Brutus's successful cavalry charge looked from Cassius's position like enemy reinforcements arriving. He sent a scout to go find out. The scout rode toward the advancing cavalry, but couldn't identify them through the dust. Cassius waited. The scout didn't come back quickly enough. Cassius concluded the battle was lost. He turned to his freed slave, a man named Pindarus, and gave him an order. They had made a pact. If capture was ever imminent, Pindarus would carry out the act himself. Pindarus drove his sword through Cassius's neck. Cassius died on the same dagger he had used to stab Caesar. Minutes later, the scout returned. The cavalry were Brutus's men. They had won their side of the battle entirely. Cassius had killed himself over a misread signal at the exact moment the battle was turning in their favor. When Brutus found the body, he called Cassius the last of the Romans. But he refused to hold a public funeral, knowing it would destroy what remained of the army's morale. He was right to be concerned. Even with a viable army and intact supply lines, the death of Cassius had broken something that couldn't be repaired. Soldiers began deserting. Officers fell into arguments. Brutus, a philosopher by nature and not a general, struggled to hold everything together. Antony kept applying pressure. He extended his lines, cut off water sources, and sent agents to bribe and recruit defectors. For 3 weeks, Brutus watched his army dissolve around him. On October 23rd, 42 BC, Brutus launched a second assault. Whether he was forced into it by the desertions, pressured by his officers, or simply couldn't endure the waiting any longer, historians still debate. The result was not debated. Antony's forces held and then counterattacked. Brutus's lines broke. The retreat became a complete rout. By nightfall, Brutus had pulled back to a hilltop with a handful of loyal officers. The army was gone. The cause was finished. According to Plutarch, Brutus spent high. Final night, quoting a line from a Greek tragedy. He said he had spent his entire life practicing virtue and had found it to be nothing but a slave to fortune. At dawn, Brutus asked each of his remaining companions to help him die. Every single one of them refused, except one, his friend Strato. Brutus ran onto the sword. When Antony found the body, he covered it with his own purple cloak and ordered a proper cremation. Octavian, by contrast, had the head removed and sent to Rome. He intended to place it at the foot of Caesar's statue. The head never arrived. The ship carrying it sank during a storm at sea. Philippi didn't end the killing. It ended the war. The remaining conspirators scattered to the edges of the Mediterranean, fragments of a failed revolution with absolutely nowhere left to go. 60 men walked out of a room covered in Caesar's blood, expecting history to thank them. Instead, they got 12 years of being hunted across the ancient world by the people they never saw coming. An angry mob, a grieving general, and a teenager who owed everything to a name. If you made it to the end of this one, I appreciate you more than you know. Subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a like if this was worth your time, and I'll see you in the next one.